You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Imogen Edwards-Jones. Thanks for tuning into Author Stories, the podcast where we bring you the story behind the stories and the storyteller. Author interviews, writing advice, book reviews, all sorts of great stuff. If you are a book lover, Author Stories is the place for you. We have more than 550 author interviews in our archives at hankgarner.com. Please go over there and check it out. Also, check out our YouTube channel, where we also have all of the episodes archived there. If you don't find an author interview that you're looking for on the website, click on the Archives tab. There's a long list of them where you can click and download and listen right there. I'd like to tell you about some sponsors that make the show possible. Missing Wings by Andrea Luman. Born with an ability the Vilidi people of Madar believe make her one of the first to be blessed by God, Katrina's destiny unravels when her father is poisoned and her mother steals her into the human world to hide among those who hate her kind. In a near-fatal attempt to return home, Katrina is stripped of her wings. The poison meant to kill her father leaves him in a degenerative state. When her eldest brother discovers she has survived, he orders her to stay in hiding. She must wait, concealed in the human world, until the danger of their father's uncontrolled rage is contained. Grown and adapted to the human world, Katrina encounters one of her kind. The promise of home and first love leads her into a situation capable of starting war among the Vilid. Will a human upbringing, mistakes, and the loss of her abilities bar her from reclaiming her heritage? Will unraveling the mystery of her mother's betrayal lead her family into even greater danger? Missing Wings by Andrea Luman. There's a link to it in the show notes. Devin Ford, Recon, the Expansion Series Book 1. Hundreds of years in Earth's future sees the United Global Territories striving to colonize the Moon and Mars. The discovery of a clean energy source ended the world's reliance on fossil fuels overnight, and years after the resulting wars, a new discovery puts the tenuous world peace at risk, that of faster-than-light travel. With humanity on the verge of traveling to new solar systems and all the humanitarian and scientific possibilities involved, a discovery by the reconnaissance team turns everything upside down. Join the small team of the reconnaissance mission who fight friend and foe to complete their mission objectives, no matter where it leads them or what the personal cost. Devin Ford, Recon, the Expansion Series, Book 1. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Imogen Edwards-Jones on the show with me today. She has a fantastic new book out that is available everywhere. It's called The Witches of St. Petersburg, and it is a rip-roaring ride. Welcome to the show, Imogen.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted.
Well, I'm excited to have you. Imogen, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I'm a bit of both. A writer and a storyteller.
Okay. So what was the first thing that you remember, of wanting to be a storyteller?
I was very, very good at telling stories in the classroom, I think. I was very, very chatty. I was always sort of, recounting. There are some people who recount tales. Do you know what I mean? Even the most boring thing about coming to school, or people who like telling stories. So that's what I was always interested in. I was also, became a trained journalist. So I was also incredibly nosy about other people's stories. So always wanting to know what other people had been up to, what they were doing. And I also was a very avid reader from a very, very young age. So I always spent a lot of time reading books. And in a sort of weirdly obsessive way, I would also underline all the good words and phrases and turns of phrase that I loved as a child. And that went on into adulthood too. So I still do that. Sometimes if I'm reading a book from somebody whose work I'm really enjoying, I will sit there with a pen and underline things in the book to see things that tickle me or I like. Isn't that weird? But that's what I do.
Well, that's a sure sign of a writer when you appreciate a turn of phrase or the way a metaphor forms and comes alive. That's that's kind of like a chef who goes to a new restaurant and says, "Oh, I like what this other chef is doing. I'm going to borrow that and I'm going to implement that or at least take the spirit of that into my work."
Yeah, and someone like Scott Fitzgerald was the one that sort of slightly rocked my world in that way. I mean, all his beautiful books, I would literally sit there underlining phrase after phrase after phrase, thinking, why is this so brilliant? Why has he done this? Why is it so alive in my head? And then that's what I would do all the time. But particularly with him, I found his writing unbelievably brilliant.
Right. As that kid who was fond of entertaining the classroom and telling stories, was there ever an adult, a parent or a teacher, who recognized that thing in you, and encouraged you or offered any, direction, or was it always Imogen, sit down? We've heard enough.
Imogen, shut up. I think. Will you stop talking? Shut up. Yes, it was not until much later in life that I got things started clicking into place. I read Russian at university, and I was obsessed with Crime and Punishment, the Dostoevsky book, which was what completely changed my life. And it was from there on. So my writing became, I was a late developer, I think. I wasn't running the school magazine. I wasn't entering writing competitions. I wasn't that sort of precocious 15-year-old at all. My sort of obsession it was a slow burner, and it came much later because I don't come from a family of writers. Weirdly, my mother's side of my family is quite artistic. They're painters. So, but they always like to play around with words. But I wasn't from that background at all. So it was a much later, a later situation.
Well, there's a very close kinship between the visual arts and writers. I think that a lot of the same creative language can be used there. We both want lush images, and we may deliver them differently, but we're both trying to hit an emotional point, with our art.
Yes, and I also think I was given permission to be sort of broke and creative, because I think if I'd come from a slightly different family, I would have been forced down a slightly different route, in a much more regular sort of way of earning a living. Do you know what I mean? I think I was allowed to be a little bit sort of rubbish at the beginning.
What was it about Crime and Punishment that changed your world? What did you get from Dostoevsky that you didn't get from anywhere else?
Well, have you read the book? Have you?
Yes.
Oh my God, it's just brilliant. I think it was the exploration of that very, very, very dark world, and the idea of the ends justifying the means, and that sort of mad arrogance of youth that I sort of slightly had actually at that age. I read it at the age of 18, and it is all about the mad arrogance of youth and the idea that you're an extraordinary person when in fact most of us are quite banal. And it really, really tickled my all my taste buds. It was extraordinary. And I was about to go to university to read Spanish and Spanish literature, and the Dostoevsky was the first bit of Russian literature that I had read. And it opened up, it was my gateway novel into the work of Russian literature, because from then on, I just was obsessed, and I went into that world in a very sort of extraordinary way. It was amazing. So for me, it was a life-changing book. If there ever was a book that changed my life, it was that. And so I changed courses. I'm not doing Spanish. I'm going to do Russian. I'm going to learn it from scratch. And I'm going to spend 4 years doing this. And that's what I did. It was amazing.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
There's an interesting literary tradition with Russian literature in that can be very different from a lot of Western literature because they're not afraid to paint a bleak picture.
Yes.
And to let humanity be humanity instead of us trying to shoehorn the story into some happy ending that we are prone to do a lot.
Yeah, they also talk about this soul,
right?
Yeah, the Russian soul, without embarrassment. Whereas the rest of us, we find that sort of thing. They're very, very good at beating themselves up, Russians, and they also have this extraordinary. There's a word called buit, which doesn't really exist in any other language, which basically means sort of your fate. But it's sort of it implies that it's a depressing fate. And so the world impacts on you. And as a Russian, you have there's nothing you can do about it. So you don't have control over your own fate, which is one thing which they're very, very obsessed with, which I found just fantastic and mournful and depressing and maudlin and, drunken and too much vodka and, all is very raw and emotional. They're very good at examining their feelings, which when you're in your late teens, early 20s is so beguiling and attractive.
Oh, yes. It kind of hits all of those notes that the hormones are opening up.
Yeah, you're deeply disturbed. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you go to university, you're reading Russian,
yeah.
And you've been given permission by your very artistic family to explore this and to not have it necessarily, in America especially, when we graduate high school, as we call it, the primary school, and then go off to university, it's usually with a purpose. We're going to study something so that we can be something.
Yeah.
And kind of the tradition of the liberal arts degree where you just go to learn things and to learn how to learn, is dwindling. Those things are going away. So that's fantastic that you're just given the opportunity. But during this time, did you have an eye toward, okay, when I'm finished here, what am I going to do with my life? I know you became a journalist, but when did that kind of become a priority?
Well, that was because I was living in incredibly exciting times. The Berlin Wall was coming down, and Eastern Europe was falling apart. And I was learning Russian, so I suddenly that part of my brain woke up and thought, this is a really brilliant time to be alive, and it's really exciting and interesting. And so then I started writing for newspapers while I was at university. So I started writing for a magazine called a newspaper called the Independent newspaper. And I had some articles published when I spent some time in the old Soviet Union as it was falling apart, because part of my degree was I had to spend a year abroad. So I spent 6 months in the Ivory Coast in West Africa.
Wow.
And then I spent 6 months in Kiev University, which was in the Ukraine. And that was still part of the Soviet Union then. And it was under Gorbachev and Perestroika, and so I wrote some articles for the Independent then about Perestroika, what Perestroika was doing to modern art. I mean, what I knew about that, I've no idea, but at least I pretended I knew an awful lot about that at the time. There's an element of bullshit going on, I think.
Right. Well, there's a fair amount of that in all journalism, I think.
Yeah. So by the time I got back from my year abroad and I had my last year at university, I was already primed I was applying to go to Reuters, I was trying to get into Agence France Presse. I was trying to get into the BBC. I was doing all those trying to get into all those trainee schemes right at the very end when I was still at university. And then right at the end, I applied for this student bursary thing for the Independent newspaper, which is a writing competition. With the first one I entered, and that was the one I won. So they gave me a scholarship to do a postgrad in journalism at City University. So I was already on my way by that stage, which was very lucky.
So after doing some travel abroad and reporting on perestroika and the fate of modern art, as you kind of got your feet wet and did some actual work in the field, did a direction start to form where you say, okay, well, this is the type of journalism I want to do? Did that started coalescing with you? Yeah.
Well, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, obviously, because that's the glamour job. Everyone wants to be the foreign correspondent. What you really want to be is they're known as the fireman, and the fireman sits at the desk, and he's got two cases packed, one for a hot country and one for a cold country, and you're sitting there with your feet up. And then suddenly at 10:30 in the morning, someone walks up and goes, right, you're off to Bogota now. And that was the job I wanted. But in the end, I ended up being sent by the editor of the Mail on Sunday, which is a big tabloid newspaper in the UK, to go and cover the first 100 days of the collapse of communism. So I was sent to Moscow with a lovely photographer who and just the two of us, and I was told to travel across the whole of the collapsing Soviet Union. So from St. Petersburg right the way across to Sakhalin, which is just above Japan. And the idea was we would just try and speak to as many people as possible about as the whole of the Soviet Union fell apart. And I left Moscow in January of 1992, and I came back in beginning of April back to Moscow, and it was a completely different country. I travelled all the way across, but by the time I flew from Vladivostok back to Moscow, Moscow was completely different. The whole of the country was for sale. I mean, it was extraordinary. The whole place was falling apart. It was an amazing experience, and that was the first book that I ever wrote. So that was called The Taming of Eagles, which I wrote when I was 23. And that was just incredibly lucky. And years later, I said to the editor of the newspaper, Stuart Stephen, I said, why did you send me? And he said, well, Imogen, you were keen and cheap, which I think basically being a metaphor for the whole of my life.
As it is for so many of us.
Yeah, keen and cheap. That's what you.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I'm going to tell my wife that.
Yeah, keen and cheap. That's the way to get on, I tell you.
Right. As a person who is such a fan, such a lover of Russian literature, and had really studied that culture and the art from there. When you are traveling through there at the collapse of the Soviet Union, what did that do for your the ideas, the images that you had built up about this place and these people, and how do you feel that witnessing that that complete sea change in the culture? How do you think that affected the way? Do you feel like it affected your creativity at all?
Yeah, well, it was a life-changing experience, and it was very extremely fascinating to see what massive change does to a people. They were so discombobulated. They was all that they knew and trusted was no longer the case, and they were sort of pulled blinking into a future that none of them knew or understood. They were changing communism for capitalism, which was something they literally did not understand. And it was extraordinarily depressing and exciting at the same time, which sounds an odd combination. It was very alcohol fueled. There was mostly people just drank vodka in order to get through it because it was just difficult. But at the same time, that the Russian soul that we were talking about before, the sort of this amazing strength of a people, and their incredible generosity to me and my lovely photographer, who we just went through from village to village and stayed with people and knocked on their doors and stayed the night and listened to their stories. It was sort of the strength of the human soul and spirit was the one thing that I really took away from all of it, which of course makes you very romantic, and a lot of my love affair with Russia is all to do with that romance and that love of the Russian soul. And so I think maybe it makes me sort of a bit more creatively susceptible to sort of being a little bit more maudlin, but at the same time sort of, the idea that you can laugh and cry within a paragraph is sort of, what I ended up taking away from it, I think.
And you come back to this place that you love so much in your new book, The Witches of St. Petersburg. Yeah. But before we get to that, you took a bit of a detour for several books with the Babylon series. Yes. Tell me about how this came to be, and what happened after leaving Russia that then brought this about.
Well, it's circumstances, isn't it? You end up thinking you're going to do one thing, and suddenly someone else offers you a job in a different direction. And I often think that if you're a writer, you just have to write. It's your job to keep writing. And you may have these wonderful ideas about who you want to be and what you want to do. But, writers write, and you've got to earn your money and earn your keep. Otherwise, you may as well do something else. So I ended up going back into normal, I suppose, in inverted commas, journalism, and so then ended up having all these columns on newspapers writing about funny things, and then I ended up writing sort of comic satirical novels. So I did 3 or 4 comic novels, and then I was introduced to a manager of a 5-star hotel, and he wanted me to write his biography. But he himself wasn't very interesting, but his stories were amazing. And it was just when, do you remember 24, that TV show had started? So,
sure.
And that rocked everyone's world, that TV show, because it was such a brilliant way of telling a story. The idea that all this happened in 24 hours. And
it's real time.
Yeah, real time. And the pressure was just being ratcheted up every 5 minutes or so, with the ticking of the clock. And you
got to hear Jack Bauer scream, "Damn it, Chloe!" 3 or 4 times an episode.
Exactly. So that was a massive hit over in the UK at the time, and rightly so, because it was a brilliant piece of television. So I had this sort of idea of stealing the 24 format and taking all his stories from 20 years of being in the front line of hospitality, and creating this idea that it all happened 24 hours in a hotel, and then that was a huge hit. That book, it went all over the world. It was made into a television show by the BBC that ran for 4 years. It was published in 40 countries. I mean, it was a sort of juggernaut of a book that I was not expecting to happen at all. It was that changed my career, actually, that book.
So you were collecting these stories from and re-envisioning them in the story of the day kind of format. This is the 24 hours in the life of a hotel.
Yeah.
Where did the idea for the name Hotel Babylon?
Babylon just means sort of decadent chaos.
Right.
Babylonian hordes, the idea of sort of this decadent chaos of And also, it just sounds a bit sort of degenerate, doesn't it?
We've got that old, novel, Hollywood Babylon,
yes,
where they just kind of dished on everybody, and that's kind of the ultimate decadence.
Well, exactly. That's the ultimate bit of degenerate behaviour. Well, that's exactly the idea. So, Hotel Babylon it's a very degenerate book. It's brilliant. It's really fun and naughty, and it's got filthy, disgusting stories in it. And it's also about how they rip you off and what they're doing and how much they know about you. And I mean, it was really good fun. And weirdly, it took off in the city. So the city boys in London, they were the guys who picked it up first because it was full of filthy stories. And they had nothing they like more than a filthy story, those boys. So they literally, the gossip went backwards and forwards on their computer screens. And that's what happened. And then, so I knew suddenly that the book was doing well when I kept on being asked to go back into Moorgate, Waterstones, a shop in Moorgate, where I kept on asking me to sign more and more books. And because the boys in the city were buying it. And then it sort of filtered out from there. So, but it was a very interesting ride. Very interesting.
Those books are credited to Imogen Edwards-Jones and Anonymous.
Yes, they are.
So is Anonymous a person, or does that represent all of the insider scope that you got?
It depends, actually, because some of them were. So Hotel Babylon was one source. So he was anonymous. And then Air Babylon, that was a whole load of different sources. So air hostesses, pilots, security guys, in the airport who scan all your luggage. I even brilliantly went to a factory where they make your food to go onto the airline food. God, it's disgusting. Right. Really, you would not want to eat anything on a plane. I had a little paper hat on and went round and did that. The security guys were amazing at the airport. They showed me so many photographs of guns and things they'd found. Then I spoke to the priest who ran Heathrow. So he's full of terribly sad stories because you don't think about all these things when you're going through an airport, how the rest of it functions. But the people who run all those prayer rooms and things, they have incredible stories to tell. So airport was that, did lots of different sources. Fashion Babylon was also lots of different sources. That was the most difficult one to do, Fashion Babylon, because the people in the fashion industry are so incredibly unreliable. They promise to meet you somewhere and then they get drunk and don't turn up.
Oops.
They're really annoying. Or they've got a hangover and they can't be bothered, or they're feeling too unwell to attend. So they were the most difficult. That was really one of the more difficult ones. You'd have thought it'd be easy because it doesn't involve sort of guns or security or anything like that. But it was the most difficult and also sort of very annoying because I would sit for hours in expensive bars all over town with my tape recorder ready to talk to somebody and they would just never show.
Well, as someone that you said was self-described storyteller and nosy, and that had done brilliant work as a journalist, I would think that those projects were just kind of the culmination of what you had been waiting for all this time. These are kind of the perfect book for someone with your personality.
Absolutely, they were, and they were really, really good fun to do, and fascinating. Other people's lives are fascinating, and also a lot of these people had such brilliant stories to tell, but they hadn't told them to anybody before, so they were bursting. It was like a sort of a tsunami of storytelling just came out. It was really exciting to listen, and some of them were just grateful that their best stories were actually being told somebody who was appreciative and listening to them.
So what brings us back to St. Petersburg and the Romanovs and this fascinating time period? What was the initial kernel that brought you back here for the witches?
Well, do you know what? When I was there in 1992, there was a gorgeous man who became my very good friend, a guy called Kolya Antonov, who was a journalist, actually. He's sadly no longer with us. But he told me the story of, they are called the Black Princesses, because they had black hair and black eyes and were obsessed with black magic. And they were from Montenegro, the Black Mountains, and they married into the Russian court, and with them they brought sort of incredible destruction. But he told me the story of them, and it has been brewing in my head all those years, 20 years, and it took a long time for me to find the time and the space to be able to do it, because there was so much research required. So it's a proper labour of love that's been sort of percolating for a very long time.
The Locust, books 1 to 3 by Ralph Kern. The complete Locust series, an epic tale of mystery, survival, exploration, intrigue. The cruise ship MS Atlantica is lost on these strange and uncharted seas, where even the compass shows the sun rising to the west. Atlantica's passengers must do what it takes to survive. The 3 books, Unfathomed, Expedition, and Osiris. Atlantica arrives in a strange new world, unable to locate land and with no way to contact home. They must find new allies, fend off relentless enemies, and discover the horrifying truth behind the Locust. The Locust box set contains all 3 action-packed novels in this best-selling science fiction. Unfathomed, Expedition, and Osiris. Acclaimed for great characters, thrilling action, technical accuracy, and a compelling sense of mystery. Buy it today from Ralph Kern, The Locust. The Renegade Star Series, books 1 through 3 from J.N. Chaney. Jace Hughes is a renegade. That means taking almost any job that comes his way, no matter the situation. So long as he can keep his ship floating, he's free to live the life he wants. But that all changes when he meets Abigail Pryor, a nun looking for safe passage out of the system. Too bad there's something off about the cargo she's carrying. Jace knows he shouldn't ask too many questions, but when odd sounds start coming from inside the large metal box, he can't help but check it. Big mistake. The Renegade Star box set includes the first 3 books in the series, 900 plus pages, 300 plus 5-star reviews. Find out why people are so intrigued by this thrilling science fiction epic. You won't believe the twists and turns the series takes, or the secrets that get revealed. The Renegade Star series, get the entire box set on Amazon, or the thrilling audiobook from audible.com. There's links to it in the show notes. Well, speaking of research, not just historical research so that you get the proper feel and the proper setting so that we as readers are completely immersed. In typical fashion, you take your research to another level. Tell us about trying to find out for yourself about black magic and how this stuff works.
Well, there's the most amazing college in London called the London College of Psychic Studies. And it's basically a sort of Hogwarts for grown-ups. It is the most wonderful place. And it was originally a sort of spiritualist, the London Spiritualist Alliance. And it was set up in, I think, about sort of 1870, 1880. And it really took off during the First World War, when everybody's sort of brother, husband, father, lover died, obviously, and they wanted to all these bereaved women came to the society to try and talk to their loved ones. So that's when the mediumship really took off there, and then it was Arthur Conan Doyle, who obviously of Sherlock fame. He was one of the presidents of the society. And it's been going strong ever since. And so I joined it about 5 years ago to learn how to do mediumship, palmistry, crystal ball reading, reading tea leaves, talking to dead people, all that. It was really interesting. And I'm still a member.
So when you first went in, how did you feel about it, with having no experience with it? What was your first, kind of gut reaction? Is this is all, a hoax? Were you a true believer? How did you go into the blank slate?
I was a bit scared, actually, to be fair.
Like scared that it might be true?
Yes, scared that it might be true, scared of opening up a can of worms or opening Pandora's box and not being able to close it. I think the dark arts are certainly very powerful, and because I knew what these girls had been through, my witches in St. Petersburg, I was very wary of not taking it seriously, and thinking I might be able to sort of take the piss a bit and thinking it's quite funny. And it actually wasn't funny. And it was a little bit scary. And some of the books in their library, they've got the most amazing library you ever did see, with incredible books. A lot of them were in Arthur Conan Doyle's personal collection. It has a certain air and feeling about it that you immediately take it seriously as you walk in. Do you know what I mean? But there are also some elements of it that are frankly insane. So sort of weird things like when I was there, I took my children in there one day, one afternoon, and I left them in the library, and I said to my daughter, "You just pretend you're Hermione Granger and see if you can move the books with your brain." And then I said to my son, who was tiny then, he was about 3, and he looks like a little angel. He's got very, very, very white, blonde, curly hair, so he does look like he's fallen from the sky. And he's sitting in a huge chair reading a book on the devil, a massive, beautiful book. And as I'm walking up the stairs, I was going to meet somebody. As I was walking up the stairs, I had this almighty crash as the secretary had dropped a tray of teas and coffees and sort of screamed a bit. And I ran back down the stairs. I went, "Are you all right? Are you all right?" She went, "I'm so sorry. I wasn't expecting to see those children in the library, and I presumed they were ghosts. It happens here all the time." And so I was just thinking, oh my God, just the idea of these 2 terrifying children in this very weird library. She must have been absolutely scared out of her mind. So lots of weird things happened there like that. And I did do a brilliant mediumship course where my teacher, Jeffrey, who was gorgeous, he opened the door and he went, "Okay, I'm just going to open the door and see who comes in." So he opens the door, and of course nobody comes in, but physically. But of course various spirits do come in, and the whole the class idea was you sit in partners and you're supposed to try and work out who's standing behind your partner, and the person who was opposite me was obviously much better at mediumship than I was. And she said to me, "You've got a woman standing behind you who comes with the sound of peacocks." And really nobody would ever know, but my childhood was in the countryside, and opposite me was a farm where they had peacocks. So I used to lie in bed as a child listening to the sound of peacocks all night. I mean, how she got this woman, and basically it turned out to be the farmer's wife who'd come through to talk to me to say hello. But how the woman opposite me would know that is just extraordinary. Do you see what I mean? So amazing things happened there, amazing things. And I've seen sort of the psychic barber is his name, who does this thing where you've 200 people in a room and he just channels for an hour and a half all the relatives and friends of people who have died, talking to everyone in the room. I mean, it's amazing. It's an amazing place. But it is, I was quite scared when I first went in there. Now I feel quite at home there. But I think, yes, it does attract interesting, difficult, weird people.
As you've got this idea for the story. You've got the historical record that these people existed.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that you had an idea for the story going in. When you start realizing for yourself that, okay, there might be something here, something tangible, that I've had these experiences. Did that it had to affect or inform how you wrote these sisters, and maybe did it open your eyes to maybe new ways that you could tell the story that's probably been condensed down to kind of bullet points, crazy sisters, occult, that sort of thing?
Well, what's interesting is, history is only ever written mainly by men, and it is also written by the victors. Obviously, famously, history is always written by the people who won the war. What was interesting about this period of Russian history, which is basically in the last gasps of the Romanov court, and about the Tsarina's desperate attempt to have the baby's son that she was so desperately needed, actually, in order to keep her position in court. This is all often sort of dismissed as sort of female rubbish and boringness, and the Tsarina is often dismissed as a very sort of stupid, neurotic character by history. But also what nobody really seemed to realize is that the Tsar, Nicholas II, was very much involved in family life, and he didn't really do much governing at all. And they lived in sort of splendid isolation just in Zarsky Selo, just outside St. Petersburg. And they became paranoid about assassination, and so they basically lived this sort of almost sort of provincial, bucolic life, which was not what you would imagine the Tsar and Tsarina of one of the richest and largest empire of the world would live. So it was to come to that sort of realization quite early on, that I was actually looking at a very important piece of history, but from a slightly different perspective, was what was really exciting. I suddenly realized that actually I might have something a bit more profound to say rather than just these incredibly beautiful, beguiling characters walking through history, if you see what I mean.
Well, the very mention of black magic has certain connotations that we immediately think evil. We think, kind of our basest, first thought is, devil worshippers and just evil, that side. Did you start to peel back the layers of these characters and find more to them than what they get relegated to in history?
Yes, I mean, the black magic, it's slightly given a bad press, but during that period, the black magic and the occult and tarot cards and Ouija boards and seances and table tipping and all that were incredibly fashionable. There were these black salons in St. Petersburg where people would go and sort of while away the evening trying to sort of conjure up some dead people to have a chat with. It was because they were very rich and very bored, and they didn't really and it was like the most glamorous thing to be doing during that period. There was a woman called Madame Blavatsky who was very cool and very, very groovy. Aleister Crowley, all those people were just coming to the fore. And so the idea that after dinner you would have a bit of cocaine tincture or smoke your hashish or your henbane and sit there and do a bit of chatting to some dead people, that was what they would do in the evening by way of, whiling away the next couple of hours. And the Tsar was obsessed with calling up his father to discuss foreign policy with him. So they would Militza, who's the lead character in my book, she would sit there with him doing seances for hours while he was discussing whether he should invade Manchuria or not. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. And,
right.
There was an incredible character called Dr. Badmaev, who was a sort of Tibetan sage who would bring he was very good at bringing in various drugs and things into the palace. So they would the Tsar there's a brilliant quote from one of his diaries when he says, everyone should have a little cocaine every day. And that's what they were doing. I mean, it sounds extraordinary, doesn't it? But it's, yeah. And there's an amazing exhibition actually on in London at the moment at the Science Museum called Blood and Revolution, and which I went round, obviously with totally breathless excitement because it was all about my book. And in there are these great big medicine chests full of these incredible little bottles and tinctures and things, most of which they're in my book. I mean, it's fascinating to see. And that was what the chest is huge, the one that's in the Science Museum, and it was one of 8 that the Tsar used to take with him when he travelled anywhere. So I mean, the entourage, the sort of the madness of it all was what was so attractive for me. It was just amazing.
I wonder if the kind of laissez-faire attitude of the drug use and the commonality of it had any effect on the occult activity.
Well, I don't whether they came much more free flowing than they would normally.
Right.
I don't know.
But we're not endorsing anything here. I'm just curious.
Of course not. No. It's fascinating. Just no. It's a part of history. That's what they were doing.
Right.
It was. I don't know. I think it was sort of a group madness that happened during that period that everyone lost touch with. I mean, that's why there was a revolution. I mean, you can see if you go to St. Petersburg and you see these palaces and the wealth and the beauty and the sort of the way they isolated themselves, the way they entertained themselves. There was a ball season, a season of balls that would go from the beginning of January to Easter, and there would be something like 500 balls in that season. And the idea that the aristocrats of St. Petersburg would not see daylight for 3 months because they were out every night just having a party.
That is insane.
It's insane. And I was just trying to work out the other day why they used to do these amazing fancy dress parties where they would have incredibly exquisite, beautiful costumes that would be made months in advance just for one night. And they would be covered in pearls and rubies and, I mean, extraordinary stuff. And I was just thinking, why would they do these costume parties all the time? Then I was thinking, well, it's the only way to make your party stand out from somebody else's. Do you know what I mean? Sort of, it was Turkish a couple of weeks ago, darling. Do you remember the Turkish party? That was fun. You know, the idea if they didn't dress up, they wouldn't remember one night from the next.
But this had to feel like a bit of Palace Babylon to you. Yes, it was a bit,
and it was trying to put together the jigsaw of everything. And I mean, you know, it's fascinating how sort of some people have reacted and saying, you know, oh, but that didn't happen. I was saying, you know, I spent 8 years researching it. It did happen. I'm really sorry. You know, I'm sorry if it doesn't fit into your idea of what happened, but it did happen. So these girls eventually, in the last throw of the dice, they bring in Rasputin into the Russian court. And he is the best character ever in the world of books, literature, history, everything. You know, I mean...
Well, yeah, you get to take your crazy to a whole other level.
Yes. I mean, he's just the best character ever to have existed. You know, right. The peasant from nowhere who ends up in the highest office in the land. Just because he was, I think, a rather brilliant hypnotist. I think he was capable of healing. I think he did have healing hands. But he was sort of debauched, mad satire who preyed on the lusts of women. I mean, you know, the idea that he had, which is so Russian, the idea that in order to get closer to God, one should sin in order to repent. So you had to have sins in order to repent them, and only when you repented, then you became closer to God. So that's the philosophy behind the Callisti, which is that sort of religious sect that he was supposed to be part of. So, you know, only by group sinning and then saying you're terribly sorry do you feel religious.
I've heard stranger things, actually, believe it or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you have these facts that you start uncovering and you start looking deeper into the nature of what's going on and the nature of why characters start doing what they're doing, and you have historical figures that we have accounts of, and some have been condensed down and glossed over to make the participants look better, or situations look better. When you sit down with the keyboard of a fiction writer, who is dealing with factual situations and true people, where do you start taking liberties with the story so that you can be true to the people and events, but to add your artistic license?
Well, that is the $65,000 question.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very, very difficult thing, and I did. This story has been through many drafts, as you can imagine. The first draft that I wrote was sort of 100% within my abilities as factually correct. So, and the problem with that is it becomes quite stultifying to read, and if you keep it's like having a static camera looking at a scene, and you're what you aren't doing is playing with any angles. Do you see what I mean? So it was it was quite boring, actually. And then also you have to use your imagination. I had this a friend of mine who was very good at tarot sent to me the tarot card which has the Fool on it. I don't know if you ever see tarot, but yeah, the Fool. So the Fool is dancing with his arms out, dancing down a hillside, playing with a little pan pipe, I think he is. And she said, you need to write more like that. That's what the tarot was saying. So then you need to have some more take a bit more liberties with things, but at the same time you have to hit your mark. So when you're doing, say, the canonization of, there's an amazing scene in the book where they all go south to canonize this saint, and the Tsar and Tsarina bathe in the rivers of the Savrov, which is supposed to be transformative. And this is when she actually gets pregnant with the baby boy. And that is all entirely true. And there are photographs of them there, and the description of the incredible church service and them walking from the train to the church, surrounded by thousands of people, is all true. So what you do is you can take a few liberties a tiny bit early on, but those big scenes that are played out with historical fact have to hit their mark with absolutely everything being correct. The hat that she's wearing, the clothes that she's got on, the temperature of the day, how dusty it was, the people surrounding where they were, the adoring crowds where they were hanging from trees and sitting on rooftops as they walked through the village. Through the city, sorry. So it's just, all those things have to be completely correct. But you can twiddle around with a couple of other scenes with the sisters beforehand where they might have said a couple of funny, indiscreet things together, because no one knows whether that happened or didn't happen. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing about history and historical fiction, I guess, plays into that, is that we, for those of us who really enjoy the study of history and learning more about a time period and really digging deep, we become very enamored of our ideas of certain people and places and times, and it's a really interesting phenomenon that we have, the fascination that we have with the past, and with that comes when you decide to tackle a time period or a people, and sometimes people don't like your portrayal of how you see things that happen. How do you deal with that when you're dealing with a time period and a place that people get so passionate about? And if you start describing a different take, an alternate story, how do you deal with that as a writer?
Well, people, yeah. What is very interesting about Russia and Russian history, particularly this period, is there are a lot of people who purport to be experts on it and who aren't. And a lot of people are very possessive about that period of history because they think they know more than you do. And you just have to have a confidence in what you want to say. I mean, there are some people I'm looking at just before I spoke to you. There's a sort of weird review on Amazon, which I was just looking at. And I was thinking, oh God, you're one of those people.
I read it too. That's one reason I was going toward this.
And so she's complaining about about the Tsarina. There's an awful scene where she drinks her own vomit. No, she doesn't. She drinks the vomit of the one of the holy fools that's in her court. Well, that is actually true. The holy fool did do that, and she did drink the vomit. But the person who's obviously written the review doesn't know that because she hasn't spent 8 years in a library in St. Petersburg reading every single warped, weird report on the Russian court. But also, there is a very symbolic reason for her doing that in the book because she's desperate, and it's the idea that she will do anything in order to have the baby. And that is a symbol of what the desperation is, that she, as the reigning monarch, is there on her hands and knees in the snow eating this vomit. I mean, she did eat the vomit of the holy fools. Whether she ate it out of the snow is a different matter, because one of the reports I read. But I also totally understand her point of view because I did IVF. And I was desperate to have a baby. And I went through 4 years of IVF, desperately doing the most mad, insane, ridiculous things that you are told to do by gurus and soothsayers and people who say, you know, if you brush your feet 20 times a day with this special brush, you will magically get pregnant at the end of the month. So I know that feeling, and there's a very specific reason for that being in the book. Do you see what I mean? But whereas clearly the person who has written the rather rude Amazon review, God bless her, doesn't.
Well, and desperation is one of those human emotions that we don't like to talk about. We don't like to portray. It makes us very uncomfortable. Yeah. But it's a reality, and I think that's probably a badge of honor that you portrayed that in a way that made the reader react in that way. Yeah.
Well, it's a very uncomfortable scene, and it's in there for a very specific reason. Because she was absolutely desperate. And that desperation is her driving force throughout the book. Her whole life is, there's a sort of weird thing that, which will probably show you the sort of significance of this, trying to have a baby boy. So in St. Petersburg, when a child from the reigning Tsar is born, they do a cannon salute. And for a daughter, it's 101 cannons they fire, and for a son it's 330.
Good grief.
So that is that the son is worth 3 times more than the daughter, which is extraordinary when you think about it. But also you have to think about what it was like to be in the city at the time listening to those cannons. So you can imagine they go on for hours, 101 cannons going off. I mean, hours. It must take at least an hour. But also the idea that you count them so you don't do anything else but count the cannons. And then when it doesn't go to 102, you imagine you just shrug your shoulders and carry on with your day.
Crazy. Crazy.
So when it did go to 330, when the little Tsarevich was born, the city exploded with joy. As you can imagine, tables on the streets and, people having parties and drinking champagne because finally, there was an heir. Amazing.
The book is The Witches of St. Petersburg, a novel. Imogen, aside from being a fantastic fantasy read, historical fantasy, what do you hope people take away from this book other than a very entertaining read and a look into a time period that we think we know a lot about, but we're more than likely misled?
Well, I think it's what I'm hoping is that you might suddenly think of other sort of misunderstood characters, because I'm rather hoping that the Tsarina in this book, although she's desperate and awful and difficult, is you can understand her a bit more, and also, you can understand a bit more what was going on in that court at the time, and how unhappy and sort of disassociated they were from everything. So I'm rather hoping that people might suddenly look at that bit of history again and go, oh my God, it really was incredibly fascinating. And they should go to St. Petersburg, see those beautiful palaces, and then maybe not take everything that everyone says to be gospel as gospel. Because I think the next person I'm really quite interested in doing is Marie Antoinette, who never said, let them eat cake. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Woman, I bet she has a story. Right?
Oh, she does.
Yeah, rather than just being a ghastly woman who told the poor people to eat cake. She must have something else to say. So that's my sort of idea, is that, not everybody is all bad. Each character in history was a real person, and so therefore they are nuanced. So it's not, right. They aren't black and white.
Imogen, I absolutely love the book. I'm going to send everybody to get their copy of it. It's fantastic. If people are just learning about you and want to know more about you and the work that you do and maybe dig into your back catalog, is there a place where they can find you online and connect with you?
Yeah, I've got a website. I think it's www.imogenedwards-jones.com. It's all there, including some very gorgeous photographs.
Excellent. We're going to send everybody to see you. Imogen, it's been a great joy to talk with you. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been delightful.
Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. Find all the archives at hankgarner.com. Now, stay tuned for a special audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
7 men ran the farce. The 7 witch hunters. The court of Oyer and Terminer. They tortured and lied and mutilated and murdered. They knew those women up in Salem village were no witches. Their true target was the coven hidden in their own midst here in Salem town. They meant to hang the innocent until the sisters surrendered. Did they surrender? Said Jason. No. Was that the wrong decision? To let innocent women die and save themselves? What do you think? Should the coven have fought openly? Created more hysteria by swooping in on broomsticks and casting spells over Salem? Should they have killed the judges? There are no right decisions. That is the horror of a witch hunt. Everything you do condemns you. Question the judge, thou art a defiant witch. Question his laws, you question the king, and thou art a treasonous witch. Question his superstitions, you question scripture, and thou art a blasphemous witch. Pity the condemned, you pity witches, and thy Christian mercy proves thy collusion with Satan. Witch hunters are not just bad lawyers practicing bad law. They are men who place the ends before the means. They choose their victim, a man, a woman, an entire race, and mark them for extinction. All evidence is damning evidence. All associations are damning associations. All infractions, and who among us is without sin, are unforgivable infractions. Their own failings and abuses of power are shrugged away as mere vigor in pursuit of the public good. A witch hunter will have you by whatever means necessary. If he cannot find evidence, he will create evidence. He will entrap you and question you and distort what you say. He will walk you through the night until your feet bleed, strip you and stripe you, dress you in your own filth until you forget you are human. He will torture your friends until they betray you. And if anyone dares to weep at your hanging, he will drag them to Gallows Hill in the back of the next ox cart. Any man can be a witch hunter. All it takes is hatred and arrogance, and the preening self-regard that proclaims, my deeds are always good because they are my deeds. The 7 judges of the Salem court were such men. But one witch stood up to them. She stood up to centuries of unchallenged murderous dogma and pronounced the magic word, no. They burned her for it.